Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director with Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. We are in week 19 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the news today, President Trump threatens to expand federal law enforcement patrols beyond Portland and into other cities. In a Fox News interview over the weekend, the president refused to commit to accepting the election results in November. Our topic today, protecting the homeland during a pandemic, protests, and a presidential election. And no one better to talk with us today than the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Jeh Johnson. Mr. Secretary, good to see you.
Good morning, Ken. Looking forward to our discussion.
How are you holding up?
I am fine. I've basically been working from home since March 20th or so, during which those of us here in the New York, New Jersey area had to weather a pretty intense COVID storm in about mid-April to early May. And like others, I'm discovering new things about how to work virtually. My law firm, I believe, has discovered that we can be almost as productive in terms of billable hours, serving our clients, working remotely from home. And in many ways, it is actually more efficient. I can do more in one day now than I would normally when I'd have to, pick up and go somewhere. So
Sure.
I conduct a lot of my business right from this chair, whether it's practicing law, advising clients, attending board meetings, talking to you, or going on MSNBC.
Amazing. Well, look, there's no shortage of stuff to kind of pick your brain about today. Why don't we start
In
first
the
in
era of
Portland?
Trump, there is always something in the Homeland Security lane to talk about.
Well, let's start on the West Coast and maybe work our way back. But what are your thoughts? What's your reaction about what's happening in Portland and how DHS is being used, and maybe kind of give people just an understanding of DHS's role here today and what your thoughts are and what's going on. Just educate people. I mean, it's a little confusing when you see so much out there happening so quickly.
Okay, so my understanding of what is happening in Portland vis-a-vis DHS is that some federal agents have been deployed ostensibly for the purpose of protecting the Hatfield Federal Courthouse in Portland and an adjacent federal building. The Federal Protective Service, which is part of DHS and reports directly to the Secretary, has as its core mission the protection of federal civilian installations and federal buildings across the country. Indeed, during 2015, 2016, when we were in a heightened threat environment because of a number of terrorist attacks, foreign inspired, I frequently directed that we enhance our presence at federal buildings. Now, in addition to that, what the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, seems to have done is to deploy to Portland special forces of, and I use that term somewhat loosely here, special forces of Customs and Border Protection and Immigration Customs Enforcement. Groups of people in those components that are trained for certain special missions. They wear camouflage, but they're supposed to also wear patches with their camouflage uniforms. So those three components have been deployed to Portland. Now, here are the problems with doing that. Number one, I do not see how any federal law enforcement officer can arrest someone and place them in a government vehicle without probable cause that the individual has committed a crime, which appears to be the case in Portland, if I believe news accounts. Issue number two, the mayor and the governor and the congressional delegation in Oregon are all saying, don't come here. So in that circumstance, if I were the Secretary of Homeland Security right now, I'd be asking very hard questions about what are we doing if the local officials who have as their principal responsibility public safety are saying, don't come here. Issue three, when I was Secretary of Homeland Security, I repeatedly told our component leaders let's avoid one-off controversial operations or missions that could have the effect of undermining our ability to perform our core mission in the communities where we need to serve. And that could be what is happening right now. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence that the presence of these federal officials in Portland is actually counterproductive to public safety, and that there are those who are choosing to go there simply because of the enhanced federal presence. So they may be doing more harm than good. So those are my concerns with what is happening with Portland. The president has threatened to send federal law enforcement officials and an enhanced federal law enforcement presence in other cities. I hope he doesn't do that, at least not without the request of local officials, the mayors, the governors. But from all indications, local law enforcement, perhaps, in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd killing, with the National Guard, have been able to address the situations so far that have arisen in various cities. The Federal Protective Service always has the mission of protecting federal buildings.
Yes.
That continues throughout. But you have to be careful not to do things that will be counterproductive and be a setback for public safety rather than addressing public safety. I have to say, in all honesty, that this whole thing seems to have a political election year tone to it. It seems to be, as I said last night on Rachel Maddow, the Richard Nixon 1968 Law and Order playbook for a campaign, but on steroids.
Yeah. So speaking of steroids, right, I think a lot of folks were caught off guard in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the protests that happened and the visual of unmarked military-esque personnel in the streets, right? And I was looking up yesterday, I think there's something like 80 law enforcement agencies within the executive branch alone. I mean, so how do Americans kind of now step back and realize just the kind of magnitude and the different levels of law enforcement, right? I mean, that even caught me off guard as someone who I think pays relatively high attention to government, most, right? I mean, like 80 different agencies that are now potentially able to be deployed.
To most Americans, the confusion is understandable. It is actually the case that the Department of Homeland Security is the largest collection of federal law enforcement of any cabinet level agency, larger than the Department of Justice, because within DHS, you have the Federal Protective Service, you have Customs and Border Patrol, which includes Customs, which includes the border, which includes Air and Marine. You have Immigration Customs Enforcement, which includes enforcement removal operations, as well as Homeland Security investigations. You have the Secret Service, you have the Coast Guard, and along with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. So DHS itself is the largest collection of federal law enforcement. Within DOJ, you've got the FBI, and a host of other federal law enforcement agencies, the marshals, drug enforcement, and so forth. And so it can be confusing. I believe that there are circumstances under which law enforcement wears camouflage-like uniforms and maybe even removes their name badges, but there should always be a marking, police or federal police or the agency that employs you. We have to be careful, however, because past experiences demonstrate, Ferguson in particular, and even Lafayette Square, that a militaristic type response to a situation can be unduly provocative and be counterproductive. That was the experience in Ferguson. I read this morning that Congress is wrestling now with whether to permit the sale of Department of Defense military-style equipment to local law enforcement. And that's something that needs to be seriously looked at, whether a Humvee, for example, belongs on the streets domestically of a city in the United States. That kind of thing is contrary to our values in this free and open democracy. And so after Lafayette Square, you saw so many retired admirals and generals speaking out about the spectacle of Lafayette Square because it's contrary to military values to see that type of presence deployed on the streets in the U.S.
Yeah. So when you were referring to your third point about focusing on the mission of DHS, right? So take us through that a little bit, right? DHS is coming on 20 years in existence, right? But when it was post 9/11, I think the real perception was combating global terrorism. And really kind of being out there on the forefront and preempting these things. And today, obviously, when we're seeing law enforcement in the streets and then the mission kind of being altered, what's the quick recap of the last 20 years? What DHS do you think should be focused on today and into the future, right? I remember when you were secretary, there was a very kind of concerted, progressive effort to build relationships in communities. You and our mutual friend George Salim were out there in mosques and visiting
Yes.
communities across the country to build these relationships. And I feel like so much of that now is just getting pulled back and just
I'm very proud of the fact that
very quickly.
I'm very proud of the fact that I was the first cabinet level official, the most senior official of the U.S. government to address the convention, the annual convention of the Islamic Society of North America, which I did in Chicago in late August 2016. So, say all the time when I was secretary that counterterrorism should be and should continue to be the cornerstone of DHS's mission. It's the reason it was created. I'm a New Yorker. I was president in New Yorker on 9/11. And after I got into office, I soon realized that the other cornerstone needs to be cybersecurity, and that the two principal missions of DHS should be counterterrorism and cybersecurity. Now, when Congress created the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, and it was stood up in 2003, the working assumptions were that the way to effectively deal with terrorism was to solidify our borders, and that terrorism was an extraterritorial threat. And so if you consolidate within one cabinet level department all the different ways to regulate our borders, land, sea, and air, you deal effectively with terrorism. And so we put within DHS border security, port security, maritime security, and on the assumption purview of one cabinet officer, all the different ways you enter this country, you're dealing with this threat. Since the creation of DHS, we now deal with homegrown violent extremism, right-wing violent extremism, and foreign terrorist-inspired acts of violence that are not imported here physically, but are inspired through the internet, which requires a whole new model, in my judgment. And that is why I spent so much time engaging local communities in partnering to address the terrorism threat. But in addition to that, we now have the responsibility to secure our cyberspace. And so, in my view, that is the second most important mission of the Department of Homeland Security. I'm pleased that Congress finally enacted legislation to stand up the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So this is something that I pushed for a really, very long time to replace an existing component of DHS. And so we now have a cybersecurity agency of our government. But when you're Secretary of Homeland Security, when you're part of the leadership of DHS, we have to keep eyes on all different threats. Aviation security, port security, maritime security, the Secret Service, between our national leaders, the Coast Guard, and of course, FEMA. So it's many, many different responsibilities. And it's good, I believe, I continue to believe it's good to have one cabinet level official with eyes on all of it.
Right. So one of the things in all these talks that seems to be a growing theme is that the COVID pandemic is essentially an accelerant, right? So whether cybersecurity? Is this something where obviously it's required a lot of attention, we've been focused on it, but more people working remotely, more things in the cloud? Is the threat and danger associated with cyber terrorism even greater maybe today as a result of COVID? Is it accelerating it? What's your kind of analysis of that as a threat that average Americans need to be more concerned about maybe than ever before?
I have to say, because so many of us are working remotely, just like you and I are doing right now, having this conversation. There is an increasing reliance on the internet to conduct our basic business, and therefore we must be more vulnerable to some sort of cyber breach. And I'm glad to see that there's a lot more attention paid around the security to basic platforms like Zoom, WebEx. I've had to learn all of this since March. Zoom, Skype, various different meeting platforms. But there's been an increased attention toward the vulnerability of these things because we're all using it now. COVID is a whole other subject. And a lot of people ask me, how would you address COVID? It's a little like asking somebody to step in the bottom of the 8th inning, 15 runs behind. But yes, DHS should have had and should have a central role in addressing a nationwide lethal virus.
Yeah, talk about that real quick, right? Like you would assume FEMA, the notion of the stockpile. Yes. I mean, does DHS have more of a role than the Pentagon, for example? I mean, what role should DHS be playing here? I mean, I just kind of go back to the original conversation where now we have federal law enforcement coming in to protect federal buildings. But as COVID was kind of growing week over week, it was a real push by the federal government to leave it to the local state leaders, the mayors, to kind of respond and handle, getting us through COVID, right? But now, it's clear we need a national, international effort to do this.
Okay, so you have to have a clear picture of who has what responsibility in this kind of situation, in this kind of crisis. Because it is a public health crisis, the public health, public safety authority to quarantine people, to require people to stay away from work, to require people to stay in their homes, to impose a curfew, belongs at the state or local level. The president does not have the authority to tell me to stay in my home here in Montclair, New Jersey. The president does not have the authority to tell me to stay away from my law firm in Manhattan. I am here by executive order of the governor of New Jersey. I am not allowed to go to work. My colleagues are not allowed to go to work 100% full scale by order of the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. So the public health authority resides largely at the state and local level. At the national level, the federal government's role is to regulate our international borders, international travel, and the federal government has some limited authority to regulate interstate travel of affected contagious persons. It's a very limited case-by-case, person-by-person authority to regulate interstate travel. The principal role of the federal government in a crisis like this, a nationwide crisis like this, should have been and should be the allocation, regulation, and husbanding of resources, critical supplies for addressing a pandemic. PPE, mask, ventilators. The federal government, FEMA partnering with the Army Corps of Engineers, should have had a central role in allocating resources so you don't end up with situations like Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, going out with his wife and making their own deals. And
then having to hide supplies, apparently. So that
and states entering into bidding wars with each other for necessary life-sustaining supplies. The federal government has the authority through the Defense Production Act and other authorities to actually regulate this. And to the extent they don't, Congress needs to take a serious look at it, but I believe they do. That did not happen in this case. I hate to Monday morning quarterback because there will be commissions, congressional committees authors, scholars that will spend the next decade assessing how we could have done this better. But this was an unprecedented crisis in terms of its scale and its scope, but it was not unanticipated. After the Ebola crisis in 2014, I will tell you it has been uppermost on the minds of Homeland Security officials, career and political, that we could have another lethal virus like this spread across our country.
Yeah. Let's jump to the election. It is a presidential year. You were secretary in 2016, and I'd love to get your thoughts on Russian and foreign interference in the election in 2016, as well as what we're seeing today potentially. There's news this morning that Senator Ron Johnson, I believe, has received material from Russia on the Biden campaign. So this is happening in live time and not behind the scenes, apparently.
So I have no idea what Ron is up to. I can't explain Ron's actions. It does smell very political. So 2016 election, Russian interference. I am not in the position to promote a book, but I will show you this book, Rigged, by David Scheimer. He's a young author, very bright, has written this very nuanced, careful, balanced account of Russian interference in the 2016 election. It's the best account I have read so far about it. So the Russians have not been deterred. By all accounts, they are still making efforts to interfere in our democracy, to degrade our democracy, and possibly to affect the outcome of the 2020 election. They have not ceased this activity, and I suspect other actors are now in the space trying to do the same thing. There are reports of other nation states involved in the same thing. And so the response has to be, first of all, create sufficient deterrence to make the behavior cost prohibitive by other nation states. And then the way I see the threat, I divide it into three buckets: the threat to our democracy. One is the threat directly to our election infrastructure, the cybersecurity of our election infrastructure, which is what I was principally concerned about in 2016. I have to say that the Department of Homeland Security, since 2016, has done a fair amount of good work with state election officials to harden their cybersecurity. I think we're in a better place now than we were 4 years ago when it comes to what state officials have done to harden the cybersecurity around their election infrastructure. That's bucket one. Bucket two is the theft of material from campaigns and weaponizing it to embarrass certain officials. We saw this with the DNC, the hacks of the DNC. And then bucket three, which is the hardest to get our arms around, is fake news, extremist views, published and republished by the Russian government and other actors in the space. I believe that we have yet to fully understand the extent to which that activity in bucket three had an influence on the minds of the voting public in 2016. And by all accounts, they are still at it. I believe it is more pervasive than we realize. And voters have to be mindful and skeptical of this activity and the stuff we're now able to consume on the internet. And in a free and open society, this is actually our greatest vulnerability.
So let's close on this topic. Obviously, I saw you last year at a ADL dinner. We had Jonathan Greenblatt a couple of weeks ago on, and the focus was just the rise in hate, right? And when we talk about homegrown extremism and misinformation, and you contrast that with voices like that of the late John Lewis, right? What kind of softer things need to be taking place to just push back against the hate, to kind of put us in a better place? Because the numbers, I mean, from the ADL and across the board are just skyrocketing in terms of anti-Semitism, on racism and hate. I mean, you see it every day. I mean, it's just pulling the country apart.
I'm very pleased, very impressed, and fully supportive of the actions ADL has taken to combat hate speech. George Salim, mutual friend of ours, is now at ADL. He used to be at DHS. So this is a really tough problem. People ask me, what's the government's role in dealing with hate speech, fake news? I believe that the federal government, particularly the security agencies of our government, have to be extremely careful in going down the road of trying to regulate political debate. We don't do that in this country. Think about what certain federal officials could do if they had the ability to ban something from the internet because they deem it fake news. And so I think first and foremost, it is up to internet service providers, social media providers, to regulate what appears on their platforms consistent with their own terms of usage. I realize that to a large extent, this is like chasing ghosts sometimes. And there is a role for the public to play. There is a need, I believe, for the American public to be increasingly skeptical when it comes to what they read and consume. It is so easy now with these to consume a paragraph's worth of complete garbage that is labeled news or labeled information, because we don't question it. We don't spend enough time ourselves going through the mental exercise of applying skepticism to some of the stuff that we're able to read now. So there's a role for the public. There's a terrific new product out called NewsGuard, which has the ability, it's like a good housekeeping seal of approval on information that is passed over the internet. You have to download it, or internet service providers have to download it. But it's the kind of thing that I think we need to see more of, where there are organizations that can label something as, red for fake news, yellow for be cautious, and green, this meets good journalistic standards. If we, the public, are unwilling to do this ourselves, maybe we need to look to others to do it for us.
Yeah. Talk as we close just on just leadership, the softer needs of our government, and folks like John Lewis, leadership by people like you who will visit mosques and will speak at these organizations. How important is all of that, and also combating the growing hate and misinformation out there?
Well, combating growing hate, misinformation, and combating COVID right now.
Yeah.
There's some major lessons to be learned when it comes to leadership. I think two exemplars of good leadership have been the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and the governor of New Jersey, my governor, Phil Murphy, Larry Hogan, Mike DeWine in Ohio. And surprisingly, the American public is not stupid. The American public doesn't expect our leaders to have all the answers and make it go away. I think what the American public really looks for is simply to have their leaders tell them the truth. Tell me the truth about how bad the problem is and what I should do to help you address it. And be visible, be consistent, be straightforward and compelling in your message, but most of all, just simply tell us the truth about where we are and how I can help. And if you do that, I believe you are serving the people that elected you to hold office. And so there's some major lessons learned in basic political leadership as we navigate this crisis. John Lewis is an American icon. I first met him when I went door to door for him in 1977, the special election to replace Andrew Young, who was a member of Congress from Atlanta. I was a student at Morehouse College at the time. And my classmate and lifelong friend, Martin Luther King III, asked me to go door to door with him to support John Lewis in 1977. He lost that election to Wyche Fowler, who held the seat for another couple of years. Lewis eventually won in 1986, and as you know, held the seat for the next 34 years. So, great man, and we're going to miss him.
That's a great story. Well, listen, you never answer this question about your own political future, but any thoughts on your end to maybe get back into the ring or return to government at some point?
I have no plans to do that. I'm very comfortable and content in private life.
Excellent. Well, Mr.
I
Secretary,
gave
it's
it the
always
office.
another day
I
at the
gave it
office.
the
Well,
office.
well, it's always a treat to have you and to see you and spend some time
Thanks, Ken.
talking and learning from you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Our next Coffee with Ken is going to be next Tuesday, July 28th, with the CEO of the Apollo Theater. We're going to talk about the impact the COVID pandemic has had on the arts and cultural communities and institutions around our country. Thanks so much. Please practice social distancing, wash your hands, and wear a mask. Take care, Mr. Secretary. Talk to you soon.